All right, so I have a motion to close the meeting?
Second.
All right, all in favor? Aye. All right, so tonight we have our guest speaker, and it's Steve. Steve, excuse me, how do you pronounce your last name?
Lovsky.
Glovsky. So Steve Glovsky is coming to give us a presentation on Henry Knox. So Steve is a retired tax lawyer with an English degree from Harvard and a long-time interest in history and travel. In recent times, he's combined those interests as a travel writer, and a few years back, a marker around the corner of his home in Wayland, just like the one that we have in front of Town Hall, led him to the Henry Knox Trail. Since then, he's presented programs on his experience following the Knox's footsteps from Fort Ticonderoga to Dorchester Heights. Tonight, as part of the America 250 celebration, he'll offer a look at Henry Knox and the story of his cannon training, with a traveler's sense of its difficulty and perhaps a tax lawyer's perspective of the legend it has become. So please welcome Steve.
Thank you all. I'm very impressed with the turnout. Thank you for coming. If anybody can't hear me, let me know. But otherwise, if somebody turns out the lights, we'll get started. Listen, I can almost hear the oxen, horses, sleds, wagons, and men, soldiers, teamsters, and onlookers just outside. Can you hear them? Thank you for having me here tonight. I was most eager for the opportunity to talk about Henry Knox and his noble train of artillery here on this date in January, because on this night, January 23rd, 250 years ago, at least part of Knox's caravan would have been bedded down, man and beast, here in Northborough, before heading out the next morning for Framingham, where the cannon would be gathered. In the winter of 1775-76, Henry Knox did the impossible. He brought 59 assorted artillery pieces, a few cannon weighing as much as 5,000 pounds, and everything altogether weighing around 60 tons, from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to George Washington, besieging the British in Boston. Overnight, on March 4, 1776, Washington had the largest cannon brought up to the top of Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. When the British woke up on March 5th and saw what had magically appeared there, they pretty much got on their ships and sailed out of Boston on March 17th, Evacuation Day. Freeing Boston of British troops was Washington's first success as commanding general. It was a sign Continental stragglers had been waiting for before joining the cause. It brought the 13 colonies together and directly led to the Declaration of Independence a few months later on July 4, 1776. News of Knox's feat of bringing cannon that forced the British to leave Boston quickly spread throughout the colonies. Knox and his cannon train became the can-do inspiration on which the United States was literally founded. When I think of Henry Knox and George Washington, I can't help but being reminded of our recent Patriot teammates, Rob Gronkowski and Tom Brady. Washington as the tall and lanky early 40s quarterback of the Army, and Knox as the heavy-set 20-something soldier huddled up and ready to charge. On November 16, 1775, Washington issued orders to Knox. Headquarters, Cambridge, November 16, 1775. You are immediately to examine into the state of the artillery of this army and take an account of the cannon, mortars, shells, lead, and ammunition that are wanting. When you have done that, you are to proceed in the most expeditious manner to New York, to procure such of them as can possibly be had there. After you have procured as many of these necessaries as you can there, you must go to Major General Schuyler and get the remainder from Ticonderoga, Crown Point, or St. John's. The want of them is so great that no trouble or expense must be spared to obtain them. I have given you a warrant to the Paymaster General of the Continental Army for $1,000 to defray the expense attending to your journey and procuring these articles, an account of which you are to keep and render upon your return. George Washington. Tom Brady telling Rob Gronkowski to go along. And the next day, Friday, November 17, 1775, Knox left Cambridge on horseback with his younger brother, William. Complying with Washington's instruction to keep an account of expenditures, Knox began with what is both a diary and account book of his journey. It is the only contemporaneous recording of events and expenses related to Knox's cannon train, and the only recorded recollection, aside from the memories put down 50 years later, of a 12-year-old boy, John P. Becker, who worked the train as a teamster with his father. Knox's diary, left several pages gone missing, is available online from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Henry Knox was born in Boston on July 25, 1750, at 247 Federal Street, then C Street, near Summer and High Streets. Author North Callahan described the home as a two-story plain wooden building with a gambrel roof in a picturesque section of Boston with a nice view of the harbor. His parents were William Knox and Mary, formerly Campbell Knox. He was the seventh of 10 sons, only 4 of which lived to adulthood. At the time of his birth, his father William was a shipbuilder who owned a wharf and the house on C Street. In Henry's first years, the family was prosperous, and Henry was enrolled in the Boston Latin Grammar School. But by 1756, their fortunes changed as the colonial economy suffered a depression. His father's business failed, and he was soon forced to sell off the property, including their home. Henry was then 8. In hopes of recovering his fortune, William Knox headed for the West Indies and died. Henry's 2 older brothers, who had also gone to sea, were never heard of again. Left destitute, Henry at 9 had to support his mother and younger brother William. Forced to leave school, he went to work in the bookstore of Wharton and Bowes in Cornhill, the State Street area of Boston today. His boss, Nicholas Bowes, took a personal interest in him, looking after him. Recognized as intelligent and curious, Henry was encouraged to read from the store's inventory as time allowed. This made him broadly self-educated. For a boy of intelligence to be working in a bookstore was in many ways providential in terms of both Henry's future and that of this country. Henry was committed to the support of his mother until she died in 1771, and of his brother William. Henry assumed guardianship of William and continued to look after him in the years that followed, employing him in his own bookshop before the war, and then taking him along on his journey to Fort Ticonderoga as a critically needed assistant. In each of his letters home to his wife during the trip to Ticonderoga, he is always sure to note his brother's welfare. Henry's biographers also made note that he repaid the consideration that his employer, Nicholas Bowes, had shown him by assisting Bowes' widow on a number of occasions. Strong indications of a responsible and committed character. But Henry Knox was much more than bookish. Fully grown, he was 250 pounds and 6 feet tall, half a foot taller than the average male of his times. Always well-liked and not shy. Left on his own after work, Knox biographer Mark Poles speculates that pent-up anger caused by his change in circumstances and loss of his father led him to join a youth street gang and become a dominant fistfighter. But by his late teens, perhaps in line with the times, these inclinations turned him toward joining a militia group and drilling like a soldier and practicing with artillery. And from then on, military occupations became his passion. He sought out the conversation of soldiers and knowledge of weapons and strategy, gleaned firsthand when possible. While still working in the bookstore, he became a recognized authority in military literature with an apparently encyclopedic memory for its titles and their content that was later demonstrated in a letter to John Adams, who requested a list of reference materials for other officers. But Providence must certainly have intervened to place Henry at the scene of the Boston Massacre, on March 5, 1770, and place him there just before it happened. It seems for each of us there are certain defining moments which, when recalled, have a sense of destiny. Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. While the Boston Massacre was one of those moments for this country, it was also one for 19-year-old Henry Knox. It happened at around 9 p.m. near the Wharton and Bowes bookstore where Knox worked. A crowd had gathered, challenging a party of armed British soldiers, and perhaps the noise had drawn Knox's attention. In subsequent recorded testimony, Henry recalled being there without an overcoat. Had he remembered the scene in terms of his being cold? Most impressively, this young man, yet a teenager, coming across a tense scene of active confrontation, directly approached the officer in charge and, taking him by the coat, forcefully tells him, "For God's sake, take care of your men, for if they fire, your life must be answerable." This was an amazing act of courage. With perhaps the self-assurance of the champion boxer, Henry put himself between two heated forces in an effort to prevent a mutual tragedy. What might it have meant for the future if he had succeeded? For 6 years to the day later, Washington, standing on Dorchester Heights on the morning of March 5, 1776, with Knox's cannon now pointed toward the British forces in Boston, encouraged his troops to remember it is the 5th of March and avenge the death of your brethren. Henry's first noted public appearance was as a witness at the trials of the British soldiers and their captain. John Adams, at great personal risk to his own reputation, but in the name of duty, took on the task of being their defense attorney. Adams would have heard Knox testify to trying to intercede and been judged to young Henry's unique strength of character. No coincidence, then, that 5 years later, Adams became the main champion in the Continental Congress for Knox's military advancement. Many aspects of the Henry Knox story are at best apocryphal, but his interaction with the British captain that fateful night of the Boston Massacre was contemporaneously recorded and was extraordinary. Henry and his young wife Lucy left Boston sometime after the battles of April 19th at Concord and Lexington, and before the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Henry settled Lucy in Worcester and volunteered as a civilian to assist the rebel army. He was quickly overseeing the construction of critical defense works in Roxbury, across from the causeway to Boston. Samuel Adams wrote to Elbridge Gerry in September of 1775, "Until I visited headquarters at Cambridge, I had never heard of the ingenuity of Knox in planning the celebrated works at Roxbury." Remarkable, particularly for someone with only book knowledge of engineering and military defenses. Was it fate or inevitability that first brought Henry Knox to George Washington's attention? Washington arrived in Cambridge to assume command on July 2, 1775. On July 6, Henry wrote his wife Lucy, "Yesterday, as I was going to Cambridge, I met the general, who begged me to return to Roxbury again, which I did. When they had viewed the works, they expressed the greatest pleasure and surprise at their situation and apparent utility, to say nothing of the plan, which did not escape their praise." A month later, Knox wrote his wife, "I was yesterday at Cambridge. General Washington and Lee inquired after you. I dined at General W." That quickly, Knox became a member of Washington's inner circle. What artillery the rebel army possessed around Boston had been placed by the Continental Congress under the command of Colonel Richard Gridley, a veteran of the French and Indian War. Gridley was 65, perhaps in poor health after having been wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and perhaps a bit craggy in his personality. Members of Knox's former Boston militia group were among Gridley's small contingent of gunnery soldiers. Knox, after completing the Roxbury defenses, sought to renew his passion for artillery and was preferred by these soldiers over Gridley. By the fall of 1775, Washington wrote the Continental Congress requesting that Knox be commissioned to replace Ridley. Official appointment was delayed, however. Congress thought a lieutenant colonel's rank suited a 25-year-old. But Knox informed John Adams that he had as good pretension to the rank of colonel as many now in the service, and would decline any lesser rank and continue to do every service in my power as a volunteer. Heading for Fort Ticonderoga on November 17th, he couldn't know that Congress that day approved his commission as artillery colonel. Word of his appointment would catch up with him during his Ticonderoga expedition, but he didn't officially assume the title of colonel until returning to Cambridge in January of 1776. Even today, it's a bit embarrassing reading the intimate letters Henry Knox wrote to his wife Lucy when they were separated during the Revolutionary War. Full of affection and elaborate expressions of longing. My Lucy is perpetually in my mind, constantly in my heart. Had I the power to transport myself to you, how eagerly rapid would be my flight. So, what should we think of an inexperienced 25-year-old threatening to turn down a commission of less than colonel? Pretentious? Arrogant? But Henry Knox had given up much to be there. A lifetime Bostonian, he'd left it. And he'd abandoned his own bookstore, established 4 years earlier, and one that had quickly become a center for talk and association to both the British and locals of Boston. He'd met and fallen in love with Lucy when she was a 17-year-old customer of the store, but the founding of their relationship had been difficult. Her father, Thomas Flucker, was a well-off royal secretary of the province of Massachusetts Bay. The last such royal secretary, as it turned out. An uneducated, unfamilied bookstore owner was not the son-in-law he wanted for his daughter. But finally relenting and consenting to the marriage, Flucker, despite not attending the ceremony, arranged for Knox to be offered a commission in the British Army. Something even Washington had been denied after the French and Indian War. Knox could have accepted the British commission. Lucy's brother was serving as a British officer. Her family would have been satisfied, and he, with his wife, would likely have been welcomed into Boston's British society. Yet he declined. And after the couple left Boston in the spring of 1775, Lucy never saw her family again. The story goes that Henry and Lucy slipped out of Boston one night, under threat of arrest, with what little they could carry, in the words of David McCullough in his book 1776. And Knox's militia sword stitched up inside the silken lining of Lucy's dainty petticoat, according to the earlier Knox biographer, George Callahan. So, what's the story of this little account book that became Knox's cannon-trained diary? The last page of the diary shows a 1774 receipt for a keg of ink and a gross of soap that Knox must have purchased as inventory for his store. He sold a wide variety of sundries in addition to books. Frugal Knox using an old ledger from his store that he had at hand? But how did he come to have this partially used 1774 receipt book 6 months after supposedly abandoning all but what he could smuggle out of Boston? Would it have been among your most essentials? We'll never know how or why he had this notebook, and I haven't seen this curious circumstance scholarly studied. But to me, it is a simple kind of evidence that has me questioning much of what is popularly believed to be Knox's early history. What do you do when you're getting ready for your first trip? Buy a suitcase. So, his diary recorded, paid for portmanteau. Knox was painted here by Gilbert Stuart, with his left hand rolled over a cannon. Stuart staged this image because before the Revolutionary War, young Knox lost the last 2 fingers of his left hand to a gun accident. He was never seen after without concealing this disfigurement, usually wrapped in a handkerchief. A strong youth who was said to have shouldered the axle of a wagon when its wheel broke, he must have been frustrated by the limitations of this injury. Try picking up something heavy without those fingers. You have to try riding a horse. If you want to have an idea of what it was like to be Henry Knox off from Cambridge to bring back the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, you have to try riding a horse. He started off in November, but up until that April, Henry had spent his life, since a boy, working in a bookstore. Sitting during the long days, even in a chair, would have been a luxury. Here I am, clopping along at a slow pace for several miles behind a guide at Cornerstone Ranch near Worcester. When I got off, I was bow-legged and exhausted. Knox was about my size and weight. I've shrunk a few inches in the wrong direction since I was his age. But he'd have had to pull himself up with a bad hand many times a day. Then the saddle sores. My posterior was okay after only a couple of hours at a particularly gentle speed. But I'll never forget the savage beating it took on one tourist ride many, many years ago after galloping through the jungle in the Dominican Republic. And Knox, like me, would have had to have a large horse. After all, every horse can't carry every rider. And horses and their riders need to stop to rest at regular intervals and eat and drink. Back in Revolutionary times, there were frequent inns along the routes, and if not official inns, most homes by the roads welcomed strangers and their payment, which often was their principal source of getting money. Knox wrote down his per-day mileage for his trip to Ticonderoga, which averaged around 35 miles. That would have been a long day for both man and beast. And horses certainly couldn't have kept that rate up day after day. Knox, his brother William, and an aide named Miller, making the trip together, would have had to trade off horses regularly along the way. Coach travel was the most common passenger conveyance through populated areas then, and their drivers would have had to have regular stopovers with fresh stock available. A Knox letter survives in which he apologizes to an Army officer for not having seen his borrowed horse return sooner. Some writers have also speculated that Knox went up the Hudson River by boat to Albany due to one remark in the letter. Certainly, given the urgency of Knox's assignment, his use of any combination of travel means wouldn't surprise me. If I were Knox, I'd have been too preoccupied with my mission to be aware of anything else. But only in New York City 3 days, Knox somehow absorbed it all. In a letter written to Lucy a few weeks later, he describes what he saw in his impressions in detail. A little about my travels. New York is a place where I think in general the houses are better than in Boston. They are generally of brick and 3 stories high, with the largest kind of windows. Their churches are grand, their colleges and workhouse and hospitals most excellently situated and also exceedingly commodious. Their principal streets much wider than ours. The people, while the people are magnificent in their equipages, which are numerous, in their house furniture, which is fine, in their pride and conceit, which are inimitable, in their profaneness, which is intolerable, in their want of principle, which is prevalent. His diary entry says, "Glad to leave New York, it being very expensive." So, nothing about New York City has really changed in 250 years. Henry Knox must have been in New York City, given his comments to Lucy for the first time. But to say it again, he's on crucial business for George Washington and the Continental Army to bring back cannon to use against British forces under siege in Boston. Yet here, he notes in his diary buying paper and pens at James Rivington's shop. Knox had done business as a bookseller with Rivington for a number of years. Rivington even sent Knox a personal note to congratulate him after hearing of his marriage in 1774. In other circumstances, Knox would certainly have looked up Rivington on a visit to New York. But Rivington was a known loyalist and publisher of a loyalist newspaper. It's hard to imagine how Knox could suddenly have shown up at Rivington's shop without being questioned on what had brought him to the city. And that was something I would not think wise to make public, particularly in a community that had not yet embraced the revolutionary cause. Or was New York small enough back then that Knox slyly believed Rivington would hear of his arrival and be more inquisitive if a visit to him was overlooked? So buy some paper and a few pens to throw Rivington off the scent? In his letter to Lucy detailing his New York visit, Knox also critically commented about its residents' Toryism, which is unsufferable, and for which they must repent in dust and ashes. Could Knox have had something to do with the Sons of Liberty burning Rivington's shop and destroying his printing press just days after Knox's visit? Remember when you were 25? You thought you knew it all and could do it all. I've heard the question by many. Why did Washington choose 25-year-old Knox for the job of fetching the cannon? Because no one older wanted to do it in winter, or thought it could be done. Certainly, Washington wasn't going to send the injured 65-year-old Richard Gridley, then the artillery commander. Knox wanted the job of heading up the artillery, and with it came bringing back the Ticonderoga cannon. So, can't you just imagine smart, confident young Henry Knox heading out for Ticonderoga with nothing to think about those many hours in the saddle, but how he was going to do the job once he got there? Nearing Fort George, Knox made contact with Esquire Palmer, who said he could supply the sleds and oxen Knox would need. On returning from Fort Ticonderoga to Fort George while the cannon were in progress crossing the lake, Palmer came up to Fort George to finalize the order. Afterwards, Knox wrote Washington that he had ordered 42 exceedingly strong sleds and had provided 80 yoke of oxen. Washington, at the same time as he instructed Knox to go to Fort Ticonderoga, dispatched orders to General Philip Schuyler, commander of the Northern Department of the Army. Schuyler was to assist Knox in any way possible. Schuyler, a wealthy Albany region farm estate owner, had gone ahead of Knox to Fort Ticonderoga to advance all preparations for transferring the cannon and make them ready for Knox's arrival. Knox and Schuyler met briefly when Schuyler passed early morning from Fort George on his way back to Albany. This was the same day Knox was to head on the lake in the other direction. Knox tells in a letter that he delayed his departure waiting to speak with Schuyler. But apparently they didn't talk about Palmer and the sled order. What followed was a back and forth, somewhat confusing story about Knox, Schuyler, and Palmer that amounts to Schuyler firing Palmer and taking over securing the necessary sleds and teams using his local knowledge and farm connections. As a result, there were no specifically 42 sleds and 80 yoke of oxen. I focus on this because these specifications have been taken up in Knox cannon train lore. George Washington's correspondence would have been at the center of our Revolutionary War archives. So Knox's 42 exceedingly strong sleds and 80 yoke of oxen, quote, from his December 17, 1775 letter to Washington, became a central part of the Knox legend, along in the same letter as Knox's reference to a noble train of artillery. Soldiers, supplies, and even cannon had been transported across this New York region for decades. History has shorthanded Knox's cannon expedition, focusing all the attention on Knox as if he succeeded single-handedly. But while Knox oversaw the effort on behalf of George Washington and was perhaps the coalescing factor that pushed the project to a successful conclusion. Keep in mind the efforts of Benedict Arnold through June of 1775, after he and Ethan Allen captured the cannon, and the soldiers at Fort Ticonderoga, General Philip Schuyler, and countless of civilian boatmen, teamsters, farmers, and innkeepers who were in place along Knox's route. What were the soldiers from Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain thinking about as the cannon they escorted made the 4-mile portage to Mossy Point on Lake George? Early December is winter in Ticonderoga. The lake was starting to ice over in spots. It must have been cold. And shortly after the cannon were loaded on the boats and they started the 35-mile cross to Fort George, a biting headwind blew up. Then in a boat Knox refers to as a scow, one of the larger cannon must have shifted, for the boat filled with water and sunk. Near shore, its crew scurried toward the warmth of a fire already made, promising to right the boat and salvage the cannon the next day. No question, our ancestors were hardier folk. After all, only the hardiest even survived childhood. Lucy and Henry Knox had 13 children, but only 3 survived to adulthood. The homespun fabric and makeshift uniforms of these early soldiers and boatmen must have soaked them to the bone. Hardy or not, imagine how cold they must have felt, and how they must have struggled to get near enough to the fire to have any hope of drying before morning, only to get soaked again, rescuing the cannon with no hope of drying all day. For Knox and the accompanying soldiers that he took with him from Fort Ticonderoga and Fort George, and the multitude of local teamsters and farmers hired under the cause, the way to Cambridge experienced all aspects of New England winter. Arctic blasts brought the snow and ice required for dragging the sleds more easily, while January thaws made crossing the Hudson and Mohawk rivers a hazard on ice too thin to carry a 12,000-pound cannon, ox team, sled, and driver combination. Knox and his men became skilled at wet salvage operations. Most extraordinary to me, Knox never really complains and never expresses a real sign of concern for accomplishing his task. Not in his letters, even his letters home to his wife, and not in his diary, despite the fact that he may have suffered cold and wet and just plain exhaustion, and from the inevitable strain and frustration of coaxing men, strangers, suffering the same. During a layover in Albany, while he waited on the cannon being advanced along their route, he adapted his little ledger into a more in-depth diary of his experience on the expedition. Outside his letters, this diary was Knox's only apparent effort to record the details of the cannon train from Fort Ticonderoga. Unfortunately, Knox's entries stopped after crossing through the challenging Berkshire Mountains as the way back to Cambridge became clear. Yet, one extended portion of Knox's writing, I think, gives some insight into the nature of this young man. 5th, January 1776. I went up the Mohawk River about 7 miles and there crossed over on very thin ice, indeed for horses. We came to the falls, so famous in this part of the continent and known by the name of the Cohoes Falls. Those stupendous falls, inferior to none, say the Grand One of Niagara, are formed by the whole body of the Mohawk River falling at one pitch from a perpendicular of 58 feet. It is the most superb and affecting sight I ever saw. The water, falling from such a height, gave the water the look of milk. It looked like one vast torrent of milk pouring from a stupendous height. After having gazed and wondered for a long time, I returned to Albany about 12 miles from admiring the stupendous works of nature, and not a little humbled by thoughts of my own insignificancy. 11th, January 1776. Went 12 miles through the green woods to Blandford. It appeared to me almost a miracle that people with heavy loads should be able to get up and down such hills as are here with anything of heavy loads. Nobody died to be remembered and immortalized. Task accomplished, briefly talked about throughout the colonies at the time, and then largely forgotten. It made Knox's reputation as a can-doer and secured him a place under Washington's command, extending to his becoming the first Secretary of War in Washington's presidential cabinet. But the cannon train expedition was barely a historic footnote in Revolutionary War history. Sorry, my pointer is kind of But the cannon train expedition was barely a historic footnote in Revolutionary War history for 150 years thereafter. And by then, first-hand memories and physical traces were long gone. Visit Fort Ticonderoga. Heading out of Cambridge, the 300-mile journey took over 2 weeks for Knox, including his stop in New York City. But my wife and I drove there this past December 5th, the anniversary of Knox's arrival, in just 4 hours. The Fort Ticonderoga Association hosted a weekend of programs commemorating the 250th anniversary of Knox's noble train. Snow was on the ground. The weather may have been colder than when Knox arrived in 1775. Closed in the winter, except for special programs, Fort Ticonderoga is a particularly beautiful spot to visit in the spring and summer. But in the meantime, I encourage you to check out the series of videos about the fort, Knox, and his cannon train that are available on the fort's website and on YouTube. Fort Ticonderoga's motto, "It began here." I took this video so you could see the Fort Ticonderoga reenactors scaling a cannon. This is both a cleaning and a testing process. Before Henry Knox arrived, as directed by George Washington, General Schuyler ordered the garrison to go through the 100 or more assorted artillery pieces and get them ready for review by Knox. That's what Schuyler was doing at Ticonderoga before he met Knox at Fort George. According to the folks at Ticonderoga, scaling a cannon involves firing off a charge without a cannonball. Of the many artillery pieces at Fort Ticonderoga before Knox arrived, most were iron. Knox wanted the bronze guns, because that's what you use to make a real train of artillery. The cannon you see being fired is a 3-pound gun. It fired 3-pound cannonballs, so the name, and needed 1 pound of gunpowder to fire.
All right, you got that. Then on top of that, just like as if we were going to shoot the cannon, we are going to put in our wadi. And wadi, the many forms of it could be hay, straw. We're going to use junk. And junk, that's actually old rope. This old rope coiled up in a little disc. Artillerymen, sailors, they make them by the hundredweight. 100 that's 112 pounds. That's the smallest unit of measure for junk water. That's how many of them are made. Which makes sense. You think it's shot. Now once the torch range holds our pound of gunpowder and our water down the back, we're going to be shot in the right spot. And as we do that, we're priming iron to clear open the vents, but also to go ahead and pick open the torch. And then once that's done, we go into the fire. And as we prime it, please upon the horn. Now these, this is not a rifle that's powerful. This is an artillery horn. It holds a full pound of finely ground gunpowder. Has a long reputation, screws in so you can refill it, and then a little brass spout on it, so it's perfectly adapted for gunpowder caliber. Now once it's down,
I'm going to be in the room upstairs.
Nice. With our lipstick. I love that. Yeah. First, with a nice hot pepper. With that. Fire.
That scared the hell out of me. Sorry.
That was good line.
I thought it was going to be a minute.
Now for a bronze.
I'm embarrassed to say that I went to Harvard and graduated in the bicentennial year of 1976 without learning that Washington's first Revolutionary War headquarters was a block away on Brattle Street. That he first addressed the troops on the Common just across from my freshman dorm, and that colonial soldiers were housed in the older buildings in the yard and had snowball fights on the lawns that I walked across to class. Take the tour of Washington's headquarters, which later became the home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The inside is closed in winter, but the grounds are open daily year-round, dawn to dusk. Then wander across Cambridge Common with its cannon retrieved from Boston Harbor where the British dumped them, and walk on through Harvard Yard. While today's Fort Ticonderoga is a reconstruction based on surviving plans and diagrams, since New York's Pell family preserved the site in the early years of the 1900s, these Cambridge sites are original. There wasn't really much to preserve in Dorchester Heights after the British left Boston on Evacuation Day, also St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1776. Knox's cannon were redeployed to New York City and beyond for the war effort, or returned to Fort Ticonderoga for his continued defense. But ready for this coming March 17th, America 250 celebration, the National Park Service has just completed a major restoration. While March 17, 2026 will also be St. Patrick's Day, I expect the Evacuation Day celebration will be a grand time in the old town up at the newly renovated National Park on Dorchester Heights. Just follow the money. Perhaps my greatest unsatisfied curiosity about Henry Knox in the early days of the Revolutionary War is where he got the money to support his personal life. You remember the parking garage scene in the movie All the President's Men, when Deep Throat tells Woodward, just follow the money? I haven't figured out how to do that with Henry Knox. Knox opened his bookstore in 1771 with inventory purchased on credit from London publishers. While the shop apparently attracted popular attention, compounded supply issues and growing tensions in town did not make it the best time to be starting a business in Boston. Correspondence survived showing that Knox was seriously in arrears before the war. Was it hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more pounds to his London suppliers? He and his young wife supposedly sneak out of Boston, leaving virtually everything behind, and ultimately his bookstore is ransacked and pillaged. But he married the daughter of a wealthy family, and although she'd been warned by her father to expect poverty, Henry Knox certainly wouldn't have left her to that fate if he could prevent it. Out of Boston, he needed to shelter, feed, and clothe both of them. He'd worked as a child to support his mother and brother, and must have been sensitive about having money and providing for his family. After leaving Boston, he didn't enlist in the Army, For 6 months, he was working as a volunteer, and he wouldn't have received an officer's pay until after he returned from Fort Ticonderoga and assumed his colonel's commission. So where did he get his money? Had he run off with a cash hoard that he'd been keeping from his creditors? You could still go to debtor's prison for not paying your debts back then. Did he see the war as his best hope to beat his London debts? One letter he wrote to Lucy when he was on his way with the army to New York following the British evacuation is at least telling of his self-awareness when it came to money. After advising her on preparations for joining him in New York, buying a carriage, selling a horse, he says, "I need not even hint to you to be as much an economist as possible. My love thinks much more of that matter than I do." I didn't practice tax law for many years without knowing more than a few financially careless like Knox. Initially, the colonists' dispute was just about straightening out a few misunderstandings, a communication problem festering over time and compounded by distance. Americans were loyal to the crown. No one was thinking about independence. After all, what would that really mean? A bunch of pretty much individual colonies left to defend themselves from foreign powers? Weren't the French just recently beaten back? What about access to trade, markets, and goods not available here? A rich man like George Washington wasn't about to dress himself in homespun cloth. Then there was Boston itself. With dissensions along the Atlantic coast, what caused Boston to draw the primary attention of the British government by receiving the top military brass and largest concentration of soldiers leading up to early 1775? Was it the slightly shorter distance from London? Boston's historic maritime prowess? The all-but island of Boston was more easily defensible by its isolation, but that made it a poor offensive starting point, as the British Army clearly became aware by the summer of 1775 after conquered Lexington and Bunker Hill, when the British forces found themselves shut off from the mainland and under siege. It didn't help that the King and Parliament ordered a change in command in the fall of 1775. By the time stock of the situation was taken by the new command, permission to abandon Boston before winter came back too late. So, with full intention to leave, the British forces were trapped in Boston waiting for spring. Worse yet for the British, weather and privateers kept Boston from being resupplied from the sea. The winter of 1775 was a fiercely cold and snowy one in Boston. The British were cutting down trees, tearing down old houses, and burning church pews to keep warm. Hunger was a major problem. At least one officer slaughtered his horse to feed his troops. The British also sent boatloads of poor and sick Boston residents across the Back Bay to relieve the city's burden, or spread smallpox, as some claimed. Starving British deserters must have passed word that only the coming of spring was delaying a British departure from Boston. But of course, British plans might change. London might send massive reinforcements, and Washington was eager and anxious for action. Why not send Knox to bring back the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga and give the colonial forces the upper hand in assuring the British left Boston? So, up goes Knox cannon to Dorchester Heights on a warm early spring night, and seemingly without Washington firing a shot, the British carry out their intended departure from Boston, albeit a bit more rushed than they would have intended. Suppose Knox hadn't brought back the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, and the British simply moved out of Boston according to their plans. No big victory for Washington and his ragtag army to declare. No sense that the British forces weren't unstoppable. No swell in American patriotic feelings, and so no decision to join the cause for those yet undecided. Maybe with the British gone, the colonial army around Boston disbands. Farmers go home for spring planting, and tensions ease. Accommodations get worked out between British subjects and the Crown, and maybe we're all still saying, God save the King. If you want the best book on Knox's cannon train, find a copy of William L. Bound's 1975 Ye Cohorn Caravan. I got mine on eBay. It's also sometimes available on Amazon. It was really North Callahan's 1958 biography, Henry Knox, General Washington's General, that brought modern attention to the Knox story. But it seems in the nature of historic telling for the unattributed by Callahan to have become reference for later authors such as David McCullough in his nevertheless excellent 1776. There are wide discrepancies in much of the details that are stated as fact by the myriad of authors who have written about Henry Knox, Knox's cannon train, in recent years. I've even seen in several places authors stating that Knox used 1,600 oxen to move the cannon. 1,600 oxen. Can you imagine the amount of food in winter that would be necessary to feed that many 2,000-pound animals? Remember the Knox letter to Washington in which he mentioned 80 yoke of oxen? 2 oxen make a yoke of oxen. That's 160 individual ox. Whoever first came up with the number 1,600 must have added an extra 0. It couldn't take 1,600 oxen to move 59 artillery pieces from Ticonderoga to Boston. The story of Henry Knox and his cannon train is a good story, an amazing story, an important Revolutionary War story. But since 1776, when the story was repeated again and again to rally the troops and bolster the cause, tellers have embellished and enlarged it until it has become as much legend as fact. I hope what I've stated here as fact is truly fact. I have learned from my efforts with Henry Knox and his cannon train not to rely too heavily on anyone's statement of fact. If nothing else, fact is often lost in the effort to make history interesting, which I hope I have done here for you. Thank you for listening. That would have given a couple of shots to every soldier, which were about 14,000 soldiers. So there was some gunpowder, but they were in need of gunpowder. But when the British woke up and saw these cannon, posed on top of Dorchester Heights, they were really surprised. They had no idea how that could have been done overnight. And what the British first did was fire about 600 cannonballs toward these cannon on top of Dorchester Heights. Now, the elevation that they had from that level in Boston was not enough to get anywhere near the top. 660 cannonballs lined the hillside of Dorchester Heights, and after the British left, the colonials went down and gathered all those cannonballs up to reuse for their purposes. So, the British, after firing these shots, next decided they really were embarrassed and couldn't do nothing. So the general in charge organized a boat of soldiers to head out toward Dorchester Heights and try to storm it. But, speaking of a storm, suddenly a big snowstorm shows up and drives the British back to an island, and they have to stop their effort to try to go up to Dorchester Heights. And the British generals all got together after that and decided that they would simply follow their plan and evacuate Boston. So they sent a kind of note to Washington saying, "We won't destroy Boston if you let us leave peacefully." So basically, it's not clear that Washington actually ever did fire any cannon from Dorchester Heights. And it was a long way. I'm not sure. Even the British weren't sure exactly whether they would have been accurate in firing at them. They were just concerned that they would be at risk with the cannon up there. So I think you're probably right, but I think there was enough cannon, enough gunpowder if they wanted to fire a few shots, but I'm not sure whether they ever actually did.
Another question over here? Oh, this is fine.
Is it true that they brought the cannon through Shrewsbury and then all the way down? I remember hearing stories when I was younger about that. And I think there might be some kind of a memorial or something along the road.
Well, Route 20 was, pretty much, a route back then, Boston Post Road, that, was the road that commercial travel would have taken. And there's the Henry Knox Trail, which is marked by the marker down in front of your town hall building.
Oh.
And that one goes all the way from Fort Ticonderoga, and they put a new one up at Crown Point, down to Dorchester Heights. Without looking at my list, I can't remember if Shrewsbury specifically is on that list of places where there are markers. But there's one in Marlborough.
There is one in the center of Shrewsbury.
There's one in the center of Shrewsbury.
Yeah, there is.
So along Route 20, they would have come. I have a list which I'd be happy to give you, but it's not, all the markers are not in my head. So they would have come through Shrewsbury along Route 20 and stopped in Framingham. And from Framingham on, I think the question of what happened from Framingham on is more of an issue. In my view, they gathered the cannon in Framingham so that they would be far enough away, the British wouldn't even think of coming out of Boston if they heard that the cannon were there. It's too far. And then in Framingham, they would have had the time to put the carriages together, build carriages. They basically were just moving the cannon as these tubes. They didn't have any wheels, any carriages to move. So in order to actually use them on Dorchester Heights and other places, they had to build carriages. So they probably built them in Framingham. And then, at that point, in my opinion, they would have dispersed them around Boston in the most direct routes. So some of them would have gone through Wayland and on to Cambridge, but a lot of them would have gone in other routes that the local Teamsters knew in order to get them to their destinations in Boston.
Any question? Yes, with us. You, sir.
Yeah, I'm told that Knox also participated in the attack on Trenton. Any comment?
Well, I am going to say I am not familiar with I have not studied in depth Knox's efforts after he left Boston. It's taken too much of my time just to study the cannon train. But he was in charge of the artillery. He was in charge of the artillery throughout the Revolutionary War. He founded the Springfield Armory in order to organize, develop weapons and get that more organized. And so I'm sure he was at the other battles in the rest of the Revolutionary War, becoming the Secretary of War under Washington when Washington became president.
Sure. Yes.
When, during the bicentennial, I was on the Knox Trail committee for the city of Worcester, and just talking about Shrewsbury. The train came through Worcester, they stopped for lunch, but they went all the way to Shrewsbury that night. They stayed there and ultimately made their way into Boston.
When I was at Fort Ticonderoga this December, the gentleman who played Henry Knox in that 1976 reenactment, he was there, very, very proud to still be around to tell the story of having been on that reenactment. I didn't bother to remind him, because he was all dressed as Henry Knox, that he's now in his 80s at least. I didn't want to remind him that Henry Knox actually died in his 50s. He choked on a chicken bone.
One more. I'll take it from you guys.
You showed where Knox was in New York City. You showed a picture of Francis Tavern. Did he stay at the tavern?
So I showed the picture of Francis Tavern because Knox would have been there when George Washington gave his farewell address. Knox was there at Francis Tavern for that address.
For the final dinner.
And in my mind, you know, it's one of the sites that's still historically there since the Revolution. And so when Knox went to New York City for the first time and would have been down in that same area, I kind of think maybe even on his way to Fort Ticonderoga, he might have stopped at Francis Tavern. So when we did the Henry Knox Trail and went through New York City, we had lunch at Francis Tavern, and I recommend it. Very good.
So, you'll be around for a little while, so just approach Steve while he's here. There's, in the back, there's some luncheon, but there's some snacks. And thank you again, Steve, it was fantastic.